gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. In fulfillment of these warnings, the church was persecuted in the early centuries. Christians were hated and hunted by a succession of Roman emperors, beginning with Nero in the 1st century and ending with Diocletian at the start of the 4th century. But by 313 AD, the face of what was called Christianity would undergo a dramatic transformation when the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great won his famous battle at Milvian Bridge, a victory that would ultimately make him the sole emperor of Rome. Before the battle, Constantine claimed he had seen a vision of a cross emblazoned on the sun, and heard a voice tell him, "In this sign conquer." Adopting the symbol, he went forth and conquered his enemies. A short time later, Constantine would sign the Edict of Milan, granting tolerance and protection to Christians. With the emperor's reported conversion, Christianity would eventually become the state religion.
There was no Church of Rome when the book of Romans was written, but ultimately when Constantine comes to power, I don't think it was a good thing for the church. I think it was a corrupt thing. He began to put his cronies in power, but ultimately the church begins to develop its doctrine and appoint popes and separate them over the laity.
After Constantine was converted and he issued the edict that the Christians were to be protected, at least until 331 AD, when he issued another edict that those who had not come under the authority of Rome were to be arrested and persecuted, and their churches and records and all those things burned.
But if Constantine were a true believer, how could he turn and persecute other Christians? Some researchers believe it was because his faith was divided. Researcher Dave Hunt writes that while heading the Christian church, Constantine continued to head the pagan priesthood, to officiate at pagan celebrations, and to endow pagan temples, even after he began to build Christian churches. As head of the pagan priesthood, he was the Pontifex Maximus and needed a similar title as head of the Christian church. The Christians honored him as Bishop of Bishops, while Constantine called himself Vicarius Christi, Vicar of Christ. For the cause of unifying the empire, the pagan practices of Rome were eventually combined with what was called the Universal or Catholic Church. But many Christians saw in this new system an apostate union between the church and the powers of the world. Through Constantine would begin the persecution of those who opposed the new universal faith. As a result of his edict against heretics, it would be said that more Christians were persecuted after his conversion than before it. When the Roman Empire would eventually suffer its decline, the bishops of Rome would rise up and take to themselves the titles of Constantine, Pontifex Maximus, Bishop of Bishops, and Vicarius Christi, the Vicar or Substitute of Christ. As 17th century historian Thomas Hobbes wrote, "If a man consider the original of this great ecclesiastical dominion, he will easily perceive that the papacy is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, sitting crowned upon the grave thereof." Because of his influence, some researchers mark the so-called conversion of Constantine the Great and his persecution of Christians as the real beginning of the Dark Ages. Jesus had warned his disciples, saying, "Yea, the time cometh, that whosoever killeth you will think that he doeth God a service. And these things will they do unto you, because they have not known the Father, nor me. But these things have I told you, that when the time shall come, ye may remember that I told you of them. While some may attribute the beginning of the Dark Age to Constantine, the record of history shows that the name of this era was given because the Bible was forbidden. The psalmist writes, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path." But in the 13th century, Rome made a concerted effort to put out that light and to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures. The conflict began with a Catholic priest named Dominic Guzman. It could be said that Dominic, along with Pope Innocent III, were the two original founders of Rome's most dreadful engine of terror and destruction, the Inquisition. The Inquisition itself began not because of witches or as a crusade against Muslims, but rather because of Bible-believing Christians. These particular believers were known as the Albigenses, so named because of the city of Albi in France. The Albigenses often debated with the Catholic priests, most notably with Dominic Guzman, today known as Saint Dominic in the Catholic Church. Though Dominic accused the Albigenses of believing heretical doctrines, his famous testimony against them reveals important details about their true faith. He said, "It is not by the display of power and pomp, or by gorgeous apparel, that the heretics win proselytes. It is by zealous preaching, by apostolic humility, by austerity, by seeming, it is true, but by seeming holiness." Dominic argued that the holiness of the Albigenses was counterfeit and should be overcome by the allegedly true holiness of Catholicism. Initially, Dominic tried to oppose the Albigenses through preaching, but his efforts met with little success. The Albigenses were known for their extensive knowledge of the Scriptures, and they refused what they saw as Dominic's apostate teachings from Rome. In the year 1206, the Albigenses made a confession that the Church of Rome was not the spouse of Christ, but the church of confusion, drunk with the blood of the martyrs, that the Church of Rome was neither good nor holy, nor established by Jesus Christ. It was at the Colloquy of Montreal in 1207 AD where the final theological debate took place between the Catholic priesthood, represented by Dominic Guzman, and the Albigenses. Historians relate what was clearly seen as a defeat for Dominic, who was said to be no match for the Albigensan leader, Benoit de Terme. Researcher James MacDonald writes that Guzman was humiliated by his failure. Speaking on behalf of Christ, Guzman promised slavery and death to his opponents. To carry out his threat, Dominic would eventually form the Order of the Dominicans, which became the chief instrument of Rome's Holy Inquisition. 2 years later, partly inspired by Dominic's fury, Pope Innocent III ordered the famous crusade against the Albigenses.